Another in my series of videos on why Jewish apologetics are so bad. This is Rabbi Lawrence Kelemen being interviewed about his views on the evidence in favor of the Torah's reliability. Starting at minute 115 after the video intro.
Yeah, we've had an awesome conversation, and I'm really thankful for this conversation. I think the first place that I want to start is, okay, if you were to make a defense for the Torah being divinely inspired while standing on one foot, what would it be?
Right. Okay, so that's good that you added on one foot because I'm asked about the veracity of the Torah, specifically the Sinai event where God spoke to 3 million Jews. I'm asked about that very often, and a reasonable, responsible, abbreviated answer takes about 75 minutes, which we're not going to do today.
Yeah, having seen your other lectures before, I don't believe you can do any better in 75 minutes than in 3 minutes, but it is funny that you think an adequate demonstration would have to be that intellectually involved, and yet it was universally understood among the illiterate Iron Age farmers who were your ancestors, allegedly. But whatever, give us the version on one foot.
But if I had to give you the bottom line, I would say that in my experience, normal, natural things happen more than once.
Are you going to define normal and natural, or is this your definition? A normal, natural thing is a thing that happens more than once? That's not the definition I see in any dictionary, so I think you need to nail this down if this is going to be the foundation of your argument.
And that's not just true about chemical processes or physical processes. It's true about the human mind as well. The human mind thinks in certain ways. And so when people found religions, when they create religions, most religions follow certain patterns, normal, natural patterns.
Well, people do tend to think similarly quite often, sure, but then there are people who break the mold and think totally outside the box, and you get your Einstein or your Freud. Human intellectual history is not just everyone thinking the same thing for all eternity.
I know that it's possible to get away with a lie about God spoke to me last night. How do I know that? Because there are so many religions that start when God speaks to one person or two people.
And how do you know it's a lie?
I know that it's possible to get away with a claim that I ascended into the heavens, came to possess great wisdom, and now I've descended to teach it to all of you, because I can name many, many religions that start that way. It's possible to start a religion by telling people that the animals provided me with great wisdom. There's all sorts of should I say lies? I don't know if they're lies or truth.
Well, you already gave away what you think about them. You just said you know it's a lie, but why don't you explain how you know it's a lie? Isn't that the key?
But most religions start with a certain handful of claims that repeat over and over and over again.
Okay, Judaism also fits that mold as far as I can tell. God comes to Abraham, tells him to do stuff. God comes to Moses, tells him to do stuff. Tell me why Judaism is different.
The Torah's claim that at Mount Sinai about 3,300 years ago, God didn't speak to one person or two people or 5 people or 10 people. God spoke to 3 million people.
That's not the claim in Exodus. That is Moses' revision of events in Deuteronomy, but so what?
And, crucially, all of those 3 million people lived.
You mean in the story? It never actually happened, so they didn't live and they didn't die and they weren't there. But of course, in the story, they did eventually die anyway, and that's actually a pretty significant part of the narrative.
They didn't drop dead such that we only have this tradition passed to us through one person who might be lying.
But we do only have the tradition passed down to us through one person. If you believe Moses wrote the Bible, that's the only account we have. What other accounts do you have access to? There are none. So I'm not following you. Why don't we have 3 million independent accounts? We have just one person's work, and that's according to you.
But the Jews can trace themselves back to those 3 million people at Mount Sinai.
Prove it. Those people didn't exist.
If you go back, let's say 200 years ago, there was no such thing as non-Orthodox Jews. All Jews were Orthodox 200 years ago. That was before the founding of the Reform movement.
And if you go back 2,500 years, all the Jews were worshiping idols. What's the point?
And then from that point forward, meaning every non-Orthodox Jew today is descended from Orthodox Jews.
Descended from idol worshippers, too.
Unless the person's a convert. And from that point, 200 years ago, going straight back, all the Jews go back.
All the Jews go back to where? To idol worshippers?
Now, how do you get a lie like that started? If it was possible to get a lie like that started, we would find lots of religions that claim that God spoke to 50 or 100 people.
What does that have to do with what you just said about all the Jews go back? Did you just change your argument in mid-sentence? But there are religions where gods speak to people. In the New Testament, Jesus speaks to groups of people both before and after he died, and Christians consider him to be God. The pharaohs were considered to be gods and spoke to many people. In the Book of Mormon, Jesus speaks to the entire world. Even in the Bible, in Judges 1:2, God speaks to all the Israelites, but really, who cares? Why does it matter if God speaking to a group of people is an unusual myth or not? And what does that have to do with Jews being Orthodox 200 years ago? And by the way, the Exodus account of Sinai does not have God speaking to a group of people either, just to Moses. Deuteronomy revises that story to include God's speech to the people, which might give us a little indication of how myths evolve by accretions and interpolations. And that's why scholars call them myths rather than lies, as you do.
But we don't. We only find one mass revelation in all of human history where everybody lived to talk about it, they taught their kids, and they taught their kids, and you can meet their descendants today.
And that is one giant pile of bullshit. Because all you have is a story. You have done nothing to prove that the story is true. So I don't believe you can meet the descendants of the people in the story, because the story is fiction. It's your job to prove it's not.
That doesn't exist anyplace else. That tells me we're not dealing with something that's what I would call normal or natural.
What tells you? So far, you just told me that there's a story that you think is really unusual, although it's really not. So that's great, but your job was to prove it's true, and you still haven't defined normal or natural, so your claim is meaningless.
Now, okay, so here, when I was doing a bit of research, the Exodus took place, and then, if I have the numbers right, the first copy that we have of the Torah is 600 years after the event of the Exodus.
And where did you get that piece of information from? We have Dead Sea Scroll fragments from maybe 250 BC, but that would be about 1,000 years after the alleged Exodus, and it's certainly not a complete copy of the Torah that we have today. You needed to do a bit more research, I think.
So that 600-year gap, let's say, I don't know if it's a gap. I'm calling it a gap. Let's say that 600-year gap. What's the transmission between Exodus to the first copy of the Torah? So in other words, if I'm living in that time frame of 600 years after the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, and I ask my parents and I ask my grandparents, that still only takes me back maybe 100, 150 years. So how do we get back all the way back to the original event? Does that question make sense?
Yes. So that gap appears when you live in 2025 because papyrus rots. Mm-hmm. So therefore, for us to dig up a document from 3,300 years ago is going to be pretty difficult. We have very few written records from 3,300 years ago, and most of the things that we have from thousands of years ago are on cave walls. They're not on parchment.
My impression is that most of what we find are tablets or monuments or pottery. I'm certainly not an expert, but I don't recall anything about cave wall writing being a prominent feature in the ancient Near East. But yeah, finding parchment is extremely rare. But the question still stands. What is the evidence that there was a Torah or a Sinai tradition in the time of the prophets, for example?
So I don't know if I would call that a gap as much as it's just impossible to have documents from that far back.
I think if God had wanted a better body of evidence, he could have enticed the Israelites to leave better records on tablets or monuments like the other cultures of the time did, and that we keep finding today. Hey, God could have inscribed the tablets himself. That's the sort of thing he enjoys doing, right? We could have had the most continuous, reliable record in all human culture. But why wouldn't you call it a gap? It's a period of time for which you have no evidence of the tradition. Seems like a gap is the right word for you, because you believe the Torah was known in some earlier period, and then there's no evidence for it until a later period. What would you call that other than a gap? But the fact that it was known in an earlier period is something you also have to prove. I would not call it a gap because it's pretty clear that most of the Torah was not known in an earlier period, just like I wouldn't say there was a gap in the existence of the New York Yankees before 1903. There just was no New York Yankees before 1903. That's when it came into existence. But for you, I think gap is a pretty good description.
How do you bridge the gap? The answer is, let's say that 2,400 years ago, someone made the whole thing up and said, yeah, this is the Torah from your ancestors.
Well, that's not how mythology works, but what you describe sounds a lot like what Josiah said to the residents of Judah about 2,600 years ago.
So imagine what would have happened immediately. Everyone would have said, wait, this is the Torah from our ancestors? We never saw this book before. What are you talking about?
All right, we have to do 2 Kings 22 again, because I can tell already you are going to describe that very scenario. I have to do this in all my videos, so here we go. Chapter 22 of 2 Kings introduces the reign of the good king Josiah of Judah a few years prior to the Babylonian exile, and presents the story of the fortuitous discovery of a scroll of the teaching, or scroll of the covenant. The story is also presented in 2 Chronicles with some variation, so Josiah reads this discovered scroll of the law, which in Chronicles is also called the Scroll of Moses, and realizes that our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us. Oh, how sweet it would be if the narrative told us exactly what was in this scroll, but it does not. Most scholars believe it was some early form of Deuteronomy, which would certainly qualify as a scroll of the law, scroll of the covenant, and scroll of Moses, and would relieve us from imagining that there is some other scroll of Moses still floating around out there. In any case, Josiah's priests hurried to the prophetess named Huldah to get verification that the scroll is for real. Note that they don't go to check it against any other sacred sources they have. They don't say, wow, these laws are really different from what's written in our Torah. And they don't say,
wait, this is the Torah from our ancestors? We never saw this book before. What are you talking about?
And they don't say, hey, when did Moses have time to write a sixth book of the Torah? They also don't say, wait, but our Torah says never to add to or subtract from it, so how can there be another scroll? They don't say any of these things because they don't have any Torah to check this new scroll against. This new scroll is the only scroll of Torah they have. At the time of King Josiah, and we're talking here about 640 BC, which is some 700 years after Moses would have lived, and just a few decades before the destruction of Jerusalem, there is still no written source called the Torah against which this new scroll can be compared. The best they can do is ask God through the prophetess, hey God, what do you think about this scroll? And in the story, the prophetess Huldah tells them Yahweh is very angry that the Judahites have been worshipping other gods all these years. So, we can infer that not only don't they have a Torah, but in Jerusalem they are not even worshipping the Israelite God Yahweh. So either these Judahites have always been pagans worshipping Baal and Asherah and other Canaanite gods, or at some point they converted from Yahwehism to paganism, or Yahweh was just one of many gods they worshipped alongside other deities. Whatever the case, The Jews at this time were emphatically not practicing Judaism. So, King Josiah reads the news scroll to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. These would have been the most educated people in the entire kingdom, the scribes, the priests, the politicians, and so on. And the people all make a covenant to follow the laws he reads from the scroll. No mention whether this is the same or different than any earlier covenants, such as, let's just say, the covenant their ancestors supposedly made at Sinai. This Yahweh stuff is basically all new to them so far as we can tell. Then the king takes all the idolatry out of the temple. Okay, did you get that? The temple in Jerusalem was full of paraphernalia made for the worship of Baal and Asherah and other gods, which is who the Jews were worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem. The king destroys those and destroys the shrines throughout the land of Judah, so this was not going on just in Jerusalem, in case you might have thought that. And after King Josiah goes through the countryside destroying all vestiges of idolatry, he commands the people to offer the Passover sacrifice. And it says they had not done something like this since before the era of the judges. So that's going all the way back to Joshua and Moses. Again, a distance of 700 years or something like that. 700 years they had not done a Passover sacrifice this way. Why not? Did they not have a Passover sacrifice before Josiah found this scroll? Perhaps that's not so surprising if Jewish priests at this time were specializing in worshiping Baal and Asherah. So that's the story. Besides the Passover, the main thing we infer to have been contained in the discovered scroll of the teaching is the very idea of Yahweh as the sole God of the Israelites. Before Josiah's discovery, the narrative makes it pretty clear that the Jews, the people of Judah, were not worshiping Yahweh. Not in cities, not in the countryside, not the lay people, not the priests. So here's what you have to ask yourself when you're considering Jewish apologetics, and in particular any proof that relies on there being unbroken traditions. While your ancestors were busy worshiping Baal and Molech and Asherah in shrines in the countryside and in the temple in Jerusalem, what exact traditions about Yahweh's unique revelation at Sinai were they teaching their children? I think the reasonable conclusion is that they didn't have any to teach. That wasn't their faith. They were not worshipers of Yahweh. So Josiah is telling the people, hey, this is your true history. This is your true faith. Your ancestors knew it once, but they forgot. Okay, now we know 2 Kings, the story of the lost scroll of the law. Let's go back a few seconds.
How do you bridge the gap? The answer is, let's say that 2,400 years ago, someone made the whole thing up and said, yeah, this is the Torah from your ancestors.
Okay, let's say that person was Josiah, and let's say he just made some parts of it up. No need to make everything up. The Israelites would have had mythologies like all ancient peoples had mythologies. But I hope you'll specify which specific parts you imagine this person making up.
So imagine what would have happened immediately.
We don't have to imagine. We have that story recorded in 2 Kings, unless you think that's a lie.
Everyone would have said, wait, this is the Torah from our ancestors? We never saw this book before. What are you talking about?
Yeah, but nobody says that in 2 Kings. How odd, right? Because maybe that's not the kind of thing you say to a king who just slaughtered all the idolatrous priests on their own altars.
At that point, the person who's handing the Torah has to say, well, of course you don't know anything about it. It was forgotten for 400 years.
Yeah, that's basically what Josiah says.
And I happen to have gotten a copy of it last night from God, or it was only kept in my family. It wasn't kept in anybody else's family.
Or it was found in the temple, just like it says in 2 Kings. I mean, you know this story. It's not a secret. It's in the Bible that you have, and you are a Bible teacher.
But now I'm giving it back to you.
Yes, exactly as 2 Kings reports.
That person would be the second most important person in all of Jewish history.
Well, history is fickle, but Josiah is a fairly famous person. He gets a few chapters to himself in the most famous book of all time. That's not too shabby. But when you say you discover something that was lost, that doesn't really guarantee your fame. I mean, someone discovered the Hammurabi stele with its famous law collection. That was an epic archaeological find, but who found it? Do you know? I didn't either. It was Jacques de Morgan. So I don't think you can really say, well, Josiah should have been more famous. If the story is true, he deliberately deflected the fame back to Moses. Hey, he says, look what my priest found. It's an authentic scroll of Moses. The Bible certainly does give Josiah credit for acting on the discovery. Other than King David, he's probably the best regarded ruler in the history of Judaism, at least by the authors of the scriptures. So I don't really know what else you want from the guy.
Moses would be the most important. He went up on the mountain, got the Torah and brought it down, gave it to the Jews.
That's the story. I have to keep saying that because you keep assuming that it's actual history. You cannot assume what you are trying to demonstrate.
Then it was forgotten for 400 years. And then Fred came.
Fred, also known as Josiah.
And after it had been forgotten, gave it back to the Jewish nation.
Right, 2 Kings.
And we would have all over our literature the story of that 400-year gap and the amazing hero who came and reminded us of the Torah when no one knew anything about it.
And we do have that story. It appears in 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. And I'm sure you know that story, but you are pretending it doesn't exist. That is just not very honest.
But when you look in Jewish history, that doesn't exist.
Yes, it does. 2 Kings.
What we have in Jewish history is a direct chain going straight back.
You'll have to prove that.
An oral tradition which lists the names and the dates of the great sages of every generation. I have a list I can show you.
I've seen it. It's complete rubbish. Here it is.
Of sages that have a direct chain going from me straight back to Moses.
Bullshit. What you have is just your imagination, because in the biblical period, there's no evidence of what these people knew about a Torah, what these people taught each other, or in some cases, if they even knew each other, and there's particularly no evidence that they knew anything about a revelation at Sinai. So this is all just your fantasy. Complete and utter bullshit.
So that wouldn't exist. We would have our tradition if in fact there had been a lie about a 400-year gap.
The gap, in your terms, is actually much more than 400 years. Most of the Torah that we know was formulated around the time of the Babylonian exile. That is why the scriptures we have from before that period are basically silent about Torah law and Sinai mythology. Didn't exist.
That lie would have been passed down.
Like 2 Kings and Chronicles were passed down?
And our tradition would be, no, it's not a continuous chain.
Exactly. Check 2 Kings. Judaism was completely broken in that period according to the story. You seem to be deliberately neglecting that narrative, but actually all the books of the prophets also testify that Judaism was a completely broken project for hundreds of years. How can you read the Bible and not get that? I think you do, and you are deliberately deceiving your listeners by selectively ignoring it.
There was a 400-year gap, because that's what we would have believed from the charismatic cult leader who started the whole thing, and that doesn't exist.
Yes, it does. You are just ignoring it. And maybe that works fine for you. Seems like you've made a good career out of selective amnesia for 30 years or so, but don't try to convince everyone else the gorilla isn't there.
But more than that, I want to go back to my original point.
More than what? So far you've described basically the scenario presented in 2 Kings and told everyone that something like that didn't happen and could never happen. So if you're going to tell me something more, is it just going to be more bullshit?
Let's say that you could start a story about mass revelation by just handing people a book and saying, yeah, there was a 400-year gap, but here's the book. And let's say they would believe you. If it's possible for one person to get away with that, then it's possible for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 50, 100, 1,000. And I should find dozens of religions in history that have a story about mass revelation.
Why? In most religions like paganism, revelation isn't even a big deal. And the most successful religions like Christianity and Islam did terrific with the mythology they have. So you may think that mass revelation is the bee's knees, but history seems to show that it's actually not all that compelling. Now, of course, religions don't compete based just on ideas and claims. There are religious wars and all that. but I can give you a couple reasons why a story of mass revelation is just not such a great sell. First of all, revelation only makes sense in the context of a hidden God, a cryptic God, which is fairly atypical to begin with. But why would a cryptic God reveal themselves to 3 million people? That's the opposite of cryptic. The idea of a cryptic God is much better suited to individual revelation. It makes more sense, and it explains why everyone today is not also seeing God. With a mass revelation, you need to come up with additional post hoc explanations for why God didn't continue to keep speaking to millions of people. Where is God right now? Why doesn't he speak up? After all that mass revelation, why are we still relying on prophecies from 3,000 years ago that were made to just one person? Second, mass revelation is a pretty terrible idea for a religion that's intended to be widely disseminated. Basing a religion on being able to tell people that your ancestors were there does not make much sense if you plan to sell your religion to people in some other country who have no biological connections to the people in the story. It would be kind of a turnoff, you would think, suggesting that those new members can never really belong fully to the club. Third, if you're unable to produce and transmit the independent accounts of all or some of those hundreds or thousands of witnesses, and you don't want 1,000 variant traditions floating around, having a story of mass revelation would detract from the strength of the mythology. You'd be saying that all these people experienced this and that, but none of them wrote anything down except for me. That will then also require some post hoc explanation. It's very suspicious. Fourth, mass revelation leaves you completely exposed to subsequent revelations, which is exactly what happened to Judaism. If anyone can hear God speak, no matter their credentials, well, don't be surprised when anyone says they hear God speaking and they got a new revelation. It's more attractive to put revelation out of the reach of the masses. So, if you're imagining people scheming to produce a religion with a cryptic God, a myth of mass revelation is actually not all that attractive. It has a lot of flaws. And you could say that's why Judaism also did not favor a myth of mass revelation, with a couple exceptions in Judges where the author seems to forget the rules of being a cryptic God. The Jewish God basically speaks only to individuals in the Bible. It's really only in Deuteronomy, which would have been composed around the Babylonian exile, that we get the myth of God speaking to everyone. The Jews were already an identifiable people at this point, so this was not a formative myth in any sense. If you want to investigate the power of this myth, you'd have to look at what it might have done for Jews in exile or returning from exile, not how it would have been received by someone in the time of Joshua. But the point is that mass revelation is probably not very attractive if you are scheming to create a religion. Now, I don't think that religions generally start by people scheming to create a religion, except maybe Scientology. I think historically, they are generally started by true believers who have some experience they feel is genuine. I'm just laying it out this way because you seem to regard religions as beginning with some deliberate deception. And I'm just saying, if you're going to look at it that way, that mass revelation has some massive flaws as a formative myth. So there really is no reason that religious schemers would pick that approach.
Why don't I find that? If it's so easy to get that lie started, why didn't some other group start it?
Because it's not that attractive, as I just described, and because that's not how religions start.
And there were other groups that needed it. The Christians needed that.
They did? There are 2.5 billion Christians in the world. You're telling them they did it wrong?
Because the Christians came and said, God spoke to 3 million of you, but now we're getting the entire story from Jesus and more directly from Paul. Why didn't they just say that God descended and in the eyes of 50,000 people told them that the Old Testament is no longer valid and you will now live according to the New Testament? Why didn't he tell 50,000 people that story?
First of all, they didn't need to. Second of all, they believed their own mythology, so why would they make up something else? third, if they were being deceitful, as you conveniently imagine for every religion other than Judaism, mass revelation is just not the most compelling mythology, as I said. And it seems like they made all the right choices, so what do you want?
The Muslims needed that.
Did they? There are 2 billion Muslims in the world. Are you aware that Judaism only has about 16 million followers? We didn't do that great. This is like the 6th place runner-up telling the gold and silver medalist that they needed to use his trainer.
Why don't the Muslims have a tradition about how God came down and said, Judaism is no longer valid, Christianity is no longer valid, now the only religion that's valid is Islam? So I want to say that the reason that story has never been told is because you can't tell it and get away with it.
Sure you can. Teachers in yeshivas get away with it every day. But it's just not as great a story as you seem to think it is. Well, is that all you have to say? That you think it's a really great story and the fact that other religions didn't use it proves it's true? When you hear yourself say that, does that sound logical to you? I really do wonder. You seem like an intelligent fellow, and in fact one of the most intelligent of the Jewish apologists I've come across, but, I mean, if mass revelation is such a stroke of mythological genius, we Jews really did a pretty abysmal job with it. Everyone else did better with their shit.
What about there is one claim from Paul, and this is where I think I see it, but there's a claim from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:3 where he says, for what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Not sure what that means. That he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. What about that claim? That doesn't qualify?
That would be a very powerful claim if Paul would name the 500 people who are still alive so we could go to them and actually check it out.
Well, why would that make a difference? You can't check out the reports of the 3 million witnesses to Sinai, can you?
And more, if Paul knew that because he was there. The miracle stories that Paul knows about Jesus' life, he knows because Jesus told him when 35 years after Jesus died, he appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus and told him the stories.
Well, Paul doesn't specify how he knows this information. He doesn't say it was told to him by Jesus. But who told the Israelites entering Canaan their stories? Are we going to do apples to apples?
And the Christianity may be true. It might be true.
I think that's highly unlikely, but their claims have much better attestation than Jewish claims. We have Christian writings that go back to just a few decades after the key events. Judaism has nothing like that.
If it's true, it's because Paul is telling the truth.
And presumably, if Judaism is true, it's because Moses or whoever wrote the Bible is telling the truth. But in actuality, it doesn't work like that. What people regard as truth is dependent on their worldview. A person in a primitive culture might see a fire on a mountain and believe fully that that is a sign from God, if not God himself. That is the truth as far as they are concerned. And a person in a primitive culture might hear a voice in their head and fully believe that is an angel speaking to them. That is the truth as far as they are concerned. So this idea that a religion is true if someone believes they are telling the truth is just rubbish also. The fact that you believe that God is on the mountain does not mean that it is true that God is on the mountain. And the fact that you believe an angel is speaking inside your head does not mean it is true that an angel is speaking inside your head. I mean, come on, we're not 10 years old and we're not living in 1500 BC.
But there's a very big difference between the credibility of one man versus the credibility of, as you said, 500 people.
Well, that depends on a lot of things, but go on.
If 500 people who are all named would step forward and say, we were there, we saw it, that would be very credible.
I hope you're not going to tell me that in Judaism 3 million people stepped forward and said, we saw it. Because, man, that would be a whopper, but that seems like where you're going.
Paul says, I met him on the road to Damascus. It might be true. Maybe.
So,
Yeah, so let's do a little better. You said before that the Sinai claim of mass revelation is credible because it's hard to make that claim if it isn't true. Why not say the same about Paul's claim? Names or no names, making a claim about 500 people seeing something and saying that most of them are still alive creates a massive liability if it isn't true. Why don't you count that in Paul's favor? I think you'd have to give that much more credit than the Sinai claim because we know when Paul was writing. If he says there are 500 people out there, he is throwing out an actual challenge to people to go talk to those witnesses. At the time the Sinai revelation claim was presented, whether it was written by Moses or by a Babylonian refugee, there were no witnesses left to interview. The challenge, if there was one, was completely empty at that point.
am I able to apply that same question to the Exodus account? So, can we name the 3 million people that were there? Is there anybody that can come forward to say, yes, we were there? So, can you apply that same argument to the Exodus one?
Good question. Where are the independent accounts from the Sinai witnesses? You might expect 3 million accounts. The fact that you have just one is a bit suspicious.
Excellent. So you don't have to have names.
Wait, you don't have to have names? I thought you said that Paul would have been on solid ground if he just gave some names.
If you can say every single person who is alive today in Bethlehem saw him rise from the grave.
Okay, that's a nice rule. You just made that up? But the question still stands. At the time the claim was originally made that 3 million people witnessed God's speech, who was there who could confirm it? No one. And every subsequent time the claim was made, until today, who was there who could confirm it? No one.
Then it's very easy to check that claim. I don't need names. I can knock on any door in Bethlehem, and if one person says, I didn't see it, then I know it's not true. And if everybody says I saw it, then I know that it's true.
Okay, so in other words, you only know a claim is true if you can get independent confirmation from all the people who would have seen it. But we don't have that in Judaism either. Not by a long shot.
Here, what you have is a claim that every single living man, woman, and child in the Jewish nation heard God speak.
But you can't know that a claim is true if you cannot get independent confirmation from all the people who would have seen it. That is what you just said. So show me the independent testimony of the 3 million.
So now, when some charismatic cult leader comes and says, here, it says in the book that every single man, woman, and child heard God speak. And someone says, my parents don't know about that.
And we're back to 2 Kings. Oh my God. Your parents don't know about that because your parents and their parents and their parents' parents had all lost the tradition. Remember the gap? But that doesn't address the challenge anyway. The question is, where are all the independent accounts? Where is the independent confirmation? Paul didn't have it, and you don't have it. It's same. But the Christian claim is stronger because Paul, or whoever wrote this account, was actually writing this in the lifetime of people who knew Jesus. I think that is pretty much accepted by all scholars. As far as the Sinai claim, that appears in writing only 800 years or so after the alleged events. It's basically worthless.
How does he explain that?
Oh my God. How does Josiah explain that? I'm not repeating it again. Go read 2 Kings.
It's the greatest level of credibility. It's everybody heard it.
In a story about something that happened 1,000 years ago, so there's no credibility. There is no possibility of getting any reports from witnesses. In that sense, Paul's claim, with or without names, is vastly stronger. He is telling his listeners, go out there and check it out, and do it before these people die off. And we know within a pretty tight range when Colossians was composed. either by Paul or some other anonymous author who lived at the same time. Now, you can say he's leaving himself a loophole because if someone does check, and it turns out that no one in Israel ever heard of these 500, he can always say, whoops, the last one just died, you missed him by 5 minutes. But it's still considerably more risky than saying, yeah, all those Sinai witnesses died 1,000 years ago.
It's not, I don't have to name names because the whole point of naming names is I can go back and check with that person. Here, you can check with any Jewish family.
What are you going to check? You're going to go to a Jewish family and ask them what? What does your Bible say, and who wrote it?
Go to any Jewish family and say, tell me something. 200 years ago, was your family Orthodox?
Well, why don't you ask them if 2,600 years ago their family was worshiping Baal and Asherah?
There's not a Jew on the planet that can answer honestly that question and say no. Now, what did Orthodox Jews believe? That their ancestors heard God speak.
Yes, we've had a Masoretic text that includes Deuteronomy since the late Second Temple, at least.
Okay, so let's go back a few generations in that family. Were there non-Orthodox Jews 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago? No.
Yes! Talk about fabricating a myth. Oh my God, the bullshit is off the chart. First of all, Rabbinical Judaism started in the Second Temple period. Second, if you read the prophets, you know that Jews were not worshiping the Jewish God Yahweh most of the time. In Josiah's time, for example, the Jews were worshiping Baal and Asherah in the temple in Jerusalem. They were not Orthodox Jews. They were not Rabbinical Jews. They were worshippers of Baal and Asherah who happened to be living in the kingdom of Judah. According to the story, those are your ancestors. Sorry to break it to you. You should have read your Bible and you would know these things.
Which means they all believe that their ancestors heard God speak.
No, they didn't even believe in the Jewish God, and they weren't worshiping that God, let alone transmitting his teachings.
Which means what we've got is, as far back as we go in history, an entire nation saying all of our ancestors were there.
Absolutely not. You are making up a complete fiction. There is no evidence from the scriptures or anywhere else that people were telling each other this claim. Show me one piece of evidence.
That is unparalleled in human history.
You know what's also unparalleled in human history? When Sam and Frodo traveled across Mordor to cast the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom. Are you not impressed?
Yeah, that's a bit different. Okay.
Yeah, so are you going to tell the rabbi to stop bullshitting you now?
Okay.
By the way, have you ever met the descendant of someone who saw Jesus walk on water?
Never.
Wait, how would you know?
How about one of those 500 people? And ever met a descendant of them?
How would you know?
There should be millions of those people today.
Maybe there are.
Where are they?
Yeah, and where are the descendants of the 70 elders who saw God's feet in Exodus 24:10? And where are the descendants of the tribes of Gad and Reuven who settled the Transjordan? There must be billions of those by now. How dumb is this discussion going to get?
Yeah, that was good. Okay.
No, that was dumb. Don't encourage him. He will just keep telling you dumber and dumber things if you don't tell him to stop the bullshit. Trust me, it's going to get much worse.
So from your perspective, or from Judaism's perspective, the claim of the veracity of, hey, Hashem spoke to us, to this nation, rests on the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, him speaking to millions of people. Okay, let's say I can get with that. My next question is when I start to go back, and me as somebody who does believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but when I read certain things in the Bible, they're hard to really believe, if I'm just being open and honest. And that would be the fact of like a one Adam, a one Eve, a Noah's Ark, just the logistics of getting animals on the ark and the food and the water and the waste and all these. So I told you before we started recording that This could be that I'm in a psychological place where I'm putting everything under a microscope, and so
Yes,
I'm
yes,
okay with that. Um, but okay, if the Jews, hey, my faith is on Hashem, the creator of the heavens and the earth. He spoke to my people, 3 million of us at the same time at Mount Sinai. Cool. What about the rest of it? All the stories that I just talked about, or the creation being in 6 days, just about 6,000 years ago. What level of, hey, this is absolute fact? It was created in 6 days. There was literally a one man who was put to sleep, and Eve, a person was taken out of his side. Those stories, how do you rationalize them? Are they real? Like, how do you approach that?
Great question.
So I'm very into concretizing the problem and then developing the solution. So let's concretize the problem here. At this moment, you and I are on the same page. God said, I'm Lord your God, you have no other gods before me. Moshe, come up to the top of the mountain.
Well, I think that's all just a fable, and I don't even know what verse you're quoting, but let's see where you go with this.
And 3 million people heard that.
No, they didn't, not even according to Exodus.
So now, if that would be true, the 3 million people experienced prophecy, and they all saw God call Moses up to the top of the mountain.
No, they didn't, not even according to Exodus.
If you would have been there, I want to make this concrete. If you would have been there and you would have witnessed thunder, lightning, shaking mountain, God speaking, Moses, come up to the top of the mountain, I'm going to give you the Torah. Moses comes down and he says, I've got the Torah from God. If you would have been there, would you have believed Moses?
That's kind of impossible to answer because we have a scientific worldview shaped by Enlightenment principles. You are basically asking if you were an illiterate slave in the Iron Age and you saw some amazing spectacle that in your worldview could only be the work of a deity, then what would you think? Well, you might think in that case whatever the religious leaders told you to think. But we have no evidence any of these events happened, so what's the point?
Yeah, and when we say Torah, do you mean Genesis all the way through, or do we mean just the commandments of Hashem?
Okay, interesting technical question.
Well, that's not a technical question. That goes to the heart of what was actually mass witnessed. That's the whole game. What was mass witnessed, and how do we know?
When Moses came down, he came down, according to the Jewish tradition, with two things. He came down with what you're saying is the will of God, all of the commandments, and that is what the Jews call the oral tradition.
And this is nowhere in the biblical text. You're just making this up. Go on.
He also came down with the entire Torah, but in a stream of continuous letters with no spaces.
And you are also making that up. It's nowhere in the biblical text. Do you plan to provide any evidence for anything you say at all? Would you like me to tell you about the one ring that has writing on it, which is only revealed when the ring is thrown into fire? Would that be entertaining for you?
And as the Jews traveled through the desert, God came to Moses and said, okay, now put a space here, 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 and here.
This is so stupid. Do you realize how stupid this sounds? I hope Moses told God that he was being stupid. By the way, the story in Exodus tells us what Moses received from God. It's a garbled account, but the only things it explicitly says were written down are the covenant code and the Decalogue. That's if you want to believe what it says in Exodus, or you could keep making up whatever story you're making up right now.
And Moses said, wow, look at that. That tells the story of creation.
Wow, Moses is so smart. But if he knew how to read, he could have read that without spaces. Take a look at a Samaritan Torah scroll or a New Testament manuscript. How dumb is this going to get? And you're supposed to be the intellectual rabbi. Good God.
what comes next? And God said, just a minute, we'll get there.
Yeah, sure, God really said that. What you are showing everyone right now is just how gullible you think Orthodox Jews are. So when you turn around the next time and tell everyone, oh, Orthodox Jews in times past would have never believed something without verifying it, we don't just believe crazy things because someone says so, I'm gonna say bullshit. You and other religious people are quite happy to believe crazy things and stupid things without verifying anything at all. So if your explanation for the reliability of the tradition is, don't worry, it's a chain of Orthodox Jews all the way back, just as smart as me, well, that makes me very worried. Transmission by generations of people with no critical thinking ability is not a great endorsement for the authenticity of their tradition.
And as they traveled through the desert, he continued to space the letters of the Torah until just before they went into the land of Israel. He spaced the final letters, and it described Moses' death, and the book was complete.
And then completely forgotten as soon as they crossed into Canaan and remained unknown for the next 800 years. Good story. If you expect your listeners to believe this bullshit, please don't tell me Jews would never believe someone's bullshit.
So he had a continuous stream of letters that was meaningless.
I'm supposed to believe that a continuous stream of letters that anyone who reads Hebrew at a third grade level could have made a decent effort at decoding was an insurmountable challenge for Moses? Is this what you teach your students? And what was the point of this little game that God was playing?
Which was eventually spaced out and became meaningful. Okay, that was a technical point. Now,
That was a technical point? I would call that an absurd fairy tale.
back to work again. Moses comes down. If you would have been there, you would have seen the whole prophecy. You would have experienced it. You would have believed that what he came down with was legit.
Maybe so. Like I said, you would have been an illiterate Iron Age slave, if any of this actually happened, which it did not.
Okay, now, next question. Did the omniscient God who spoke to the Jews at Mount Sinai,
In the story, in Deuteronomy only. Although I'd have to say that God does not at all come across as omniscient in the Bible. Not at all.
realize that as a result of the fireworks show that he just made, the Jews were going to trust Moses?
You're asking me to guess what a fictional character in a fairy tale might have known? Well, if we're going to do that, it seems from verse 19:9 that God did expect the Israelites to trust Moses, and God seems to be the one who uses Moses as the go-between. So I think it's fair to say that the character of God in the story expected the Israelites to believe Moses.
And obviously the answer is, yeah, I mean, he's God. He understood. The Jews are now going to trust Moses.
Well, it's the text that leads you to believe that, not God's omniscience. I mean, God does not seem particularly omniscient on this point because the Israelites don't do a great job of trusting Moses. Pretty much every subsequent narrative in the Bible is of the Israelites not trusting Moses. So that was actually a pretty bad call on God's part, but go on.
That means
In the story world,
that it was God's desire that the Jews believe in exactly what Moses told them was the Torah when he got down to the bottom of the mountain,
in the story world,
which means we could rely on the Torah transmission that Moses gave to that first generation of Jews.
we can't rely on anything. That was a story, a fairy tale. In the story, God expects the Israelites to listen to Moses. Now, they clearly did not, because we have the whole episode of the golden cow right then. So the Israelites really exposed themselves as very bad listeners. But again, that's all in the story. It doesn't tell you anything about who to rely on for anything. We're talking about fictional characters.
Because God set it up so they would all believe it.
He didn't do such a great job, but again, we're in the story world. You have yet to show me that any of the story is true, and I could think of about 1,000 ways that God could have set it up better than having one person relate everything. You already said that having one person relate a revelation is a massive vulnerability. Now it's the best thing ever?
That's what God wanted them to believe. So now I've got a Torah that's accurately transmitted to the first generation.
No, you don't. You have a story about God giving some commandments, not the whole Torah, and you have a ridiculous fairy tale about God helping Moses read at a third grade level.
Then the only question is, was there some system that God could set up to ensure that the written text, excuse me, and the oral tradition containing all the commandments was transmitted intact from generation to generation?
Yeah, sure. That's the only question, other than whether any of this actually happened. I'll brace myself for another fairy tale.
And if you study the system that's used to transmit the oral tradition and that's required for actually writing a copy of the Torah, when it's written in a Torah scroll, there's extreme requirements to ensure accuracy.
Yeah, they didn't have a Torah scroll. They couldn't make scrolls that big, and anyway, they didn't have a Torah until sometime after the Babylonian exile.
If you look at that, and then you look at the historical fact that Torahs all over the world, when you look across the entire planet throughout all of history.
Throughout all of history? What's the oldest Torah scroll you've ever seen? As far as I know, the oldest scroll is only about 1,000 years old.
Have an almost identical text with a one-letter difference between the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardi community, right? The European community and the African Egyptian community.
We have pretty ample evidence that there was greater variation in the past based on translations and citations in different works, but the Masoretic text has been reasonably stable for a long time. Like you say, at some point they developed a mechanism for this.
You see that the system worked.
Over some span of time that we cannot trace back fully even to the Second Temple. Yeah, standardization of the text worked over some period of time, same as for Christian and Muslim scriptures.
That, in fact, the Torah seems to have been transmitted over thousands of years intact. By the way, in contrast, there are hundreds of different versions of the Old Testament, depending on which translation, which text, which community it came from. You're talking about thousands and thousands of years, one letter difference.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the oldest sources we have, show many variants, so you really should check this out more thoroughly.
Between the two versions of the Torah and complete agreement on oral tradition.
What does that even mean? Can you read the Talmud and see complete agreement on anything? That's a really baffling remark. But can we get back to proving whatever you're trying to prove? Yes, there has been a canonical text of the Bible for a long time. That's what mature religious communities tend to do with religious texts. Muslims are absolutely fanatical about this. So what?
So given that's the case, it seems like, yeah, God was really smart. He actually figured out a way to make sure this thing would make it through history.
No, if he was really smart, he would have had everyone chisel it on stone tablets and have left these all over the Near East so we couldn't avoid constantly digging them up. Or he could have provided a checksum for each line or other validation technology. Or he could have spelled it out in the stars every night. Or he could have made everybody just see it on the inside of their eyelids every time they closed their eyes. Or he could have had an information desk on every block where you could just talk to him whenever you wanted. I'd have to say that the way God chose to go about this is just about the stupidest way you could possibly imagine. All you are telling me is that at some point scribes developed a system for making relatively accurate copies. It's not that big a deal. The Islamic scribes did it even better for the Quran. And there are plenty of places in the Torah where there is obvious uncertainty about a particular word, hence the tradition of Kri and Ktiv, and plenty of other places where the text seems quite garbled, as though words were left out or inserted. There are variants preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are traditions of Tikkun Sofrim or scribal emendations, and Rambam writes that he saw major flaws in all the Torah scrolls he encountered, and that was less than 900 years ago. So the system that God allegedly devised was imbecilic, and the system that humans devised to standardize the scripture was better, but far from perfect. But what is the point?
So now I get back to, okay, Adam and Eve, two people. Like, is it possible that mankind started from two Homo sapiens?
What does this have to do with anything you just said about copying the Torah?
So that doesn't seem like such a leap.
Well, are we going to ignore all the evidence of evolution, evidence of other hominid species? As though archaeologists have never found anything than remains of Homo sapiens? So we're just going to fantasy world now? That's it? Man was made from dirt and woman was pulled out of his side? That doesn't seem like such a leap? What exactly would seem like a leap to you? What culture's origin mythology do you find to be too much of a leap, and why? It seems like your standards are really low.
Noah's Ark, okay, that's really a problem. I had a student who, a brilliant woman, she had a background in physics, and she sat me down and for 45 minutes explained to me that Noah's Ark could never have floated. It is absolutely impossible. According to the design of the Torah, it could never have floated. She said to me after 45 minutes, for Noah's Ark to float, it would have required a miracle.
Oh.
Yeah. So I think that might be the answer to your question.
That's a terrible answer. There is no indication in the narrative of the flood that Noah's Ark was some kind of miracle boat or transdimensional vehicle. The text describes the construction fairly precisely and does not express any surprise that the animals all fit or that it would float, and does not seem concerned about how one family could care for all those animals or anything along those lines. The author thought this made sense. His audience thought this made sense. And once you require yourself to believe the literal account, it's not just the one miracle. There are dozens of impossibilities that then all need to be solved by miracles. What about all the parasites, bacteria, viruses, fungi? Miracle. What about land animals crossing oceans to get to the ark and then redistributing themselves afterward? Miracle. How about the Earth being repopulated impossibly quickly? Miracle. How about major cultures around the world surviving the flood with nary a mention? Miracle. How about the survival of non-aquatic plant life? How about the survival of freshwater marine life? Miracle. 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 And if you dig deeper into what would be required for each of these miracles, you will end up having to say that the water wasn't real water, the animals weren't real animals, the people weren't real people, the mountains weren't real mountains, the rain wasn't real rain, the boat wasn't a real boat. So by reading the story literally, you will end up having to interpret it entirely non-literally anyway. You would do so much less damage to the story by just saying the story isn't a real event. Just enjoy the story for what it is. But no, you want it to be literally true and are happy to suspend the laws of logic and physics so that this Mesopotamian fairy tale can be true. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the discerning mind of Rabbi Lawrence Kelemen. And now, having solved the puzzle of Noah's Ark by declaring everything to be a miracle and nothing to be real, he's going to teach you all how rational it is to believe in a revelation at Sinai. Well, that's just fantastic. Please send your kids to his yeshiva to get the rational approach to Judaism. Does anyone else, I wonder, find it amusing how for 30 minutes, Rabbi Kelemen's whole presentation urges us to think hard, be logical, envision only possible scenarios, be critical, consider what's likely, what's normal, what we actually know about the world and human experience and history? We're not going to be satisfied until we find what makes logical sense. If it doesn't make sense, we don't allow ourselves to believe it. And then the moment we get to Noah's Ark, all that rationality goes out the window, and we're just going to go with miracle. I really wonder if you would extend the same courtesy to other religions for their nonsense claims. This basically would mean that every religion is immune to evaluation. Doesn't matter if it makes claims that contradict nature or history or logic. It's a miracle. No further questions.
That's if the Torah is in fact from God, then okay, yeah, the animals couldn't fit on the ark and it couldn't float, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Right.
So, in other words, you just believe all those impossible things without any witnesses or verification whatsoever. So, how about this? The New Testament is from God, and it says that Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people, so that must be true. It's from God, and it's a miracle. Or how about this? The Quran is from Allah, and it says that it was all communicated by the angel Gabriel to an illiterate Arab trader who dictated it with perfect fidelity. It's from God, and it's a miracle. Wow, we can have so much fun when we stop being rational. Why didn't we do this from the start? Could have saved so much time.